Critics argue that individual decisions are far from rational, and the models don't work because of multiple factors that influence attitudes and behaviour, such as culture, norms and habits, and because of the importance of structural and institutional factors in constraining or enabling choices. For example, even when we see attitudes that would suggest a commitment to energy savings, or when cost-benefit analysis shows it makes sense for people to become more energy efficient, people may not change their behaviour. Social science tells us that they won't change because of infrastructural barriers such as lack of public transport or thermostats to control temperatures, or because of lock-in to habits such as washing your clothes at high temperature, or even to social norms of fashion and style that say we have to throw away our electronics every 3 weeks. I've heard many times the natural sciences called the hard sciences, or the exact sciences in Latin America. And that brings an implication or direct comment that the social sciences are somehow soft. This sometimes reflects a perception that the social sciences are not quantitative, whereas many of them are, of course, but also that qualitative research is not rigorous or is easier. I would challenge anybody who says this to read the larger literature, such as that published by SAGE, on qualitative research methods or research methods in social science, which suggests enormous rigour and care in many approaches to social science. Look at the very careful field observations of anthropologists and others who record every detail of everyday life in communities that they study. And I'd also suggest, and I've done this in some sort of interdisciplinary courses, that approaching people to study their lives is often more difficult and dangerous than approaching a tree or a soil sample. These disagreements about explanation and prediction within the social sciences often confuse and bemuse our natural science colleagues. One of my favourite exercises, which I don't have time for today, is to show a picture of a farming landscape and then provide 10 completely different explanations of why the land use is the way it is in the particular photograph, each from a different social science perspective. So how would neoclassical economists explain it? How would a determinist explain it? How would a Marxist explain it? How would a post-structural discourse theorist explain the landscape? And by the time you go through that, our natural science colleagues sometimes completely give up on us. They think we really can't agree. So to conclude, let me end with some of the myths about social science itself rather than about society. And these derive from comments I've heard about social science and social scientists over the years. The first is that social science is just too political. There have been several times in my career where social science research has been threatened with funding cuts, or when natural scientists have run so far in the other direction to not be associated with social science because of the sense that social science is under political sort of focus or is seen as too biased or too policy prescriptive, I think the comment was made. And this has been particularly true around the climate debate in the US. Now, this partly comes from a confusion that people have between social science policy analysis and politics. And it also seems that when social science provides explanations of environmental change based on careful empirical work, or when we provide carefully and scholarly evaluation of alternative solutions, or when our empirical work suggests patterns or suggests certain policies, that if our conclusions threaten certain interests, our work just gets labelled biased or political. Now, this is not to say that social scientists do not bring certain values to their work, but I don't think they bring any more values to their work than our natural science colleagues do. And I think what we've got to do is to be more careful to mutually support the legitimacy of each other's work when it's attacked for being too political. I think this has become easier in the climate arena over the last couple of years because in that case it was actually the climate science that was attacked, not the climate social science. And we've tried to be supportive of our natural science colleagues, and I hope the same would be true in reverse. Another myth about social science is that it's cheap. Over the course of my career, I've heard program directors and colleagues in the natural sciences, when we're preparing interdisciplinary proposals, suggest that the research budget for social science in agencies or within collaborative proposals or for faculty startup when we're trying to recruit a social science, that the budgets don't need to be as large as they are for the geophysical aspects of the environment. Justifications include that social scientists don't need expensive instruments, that we don't need global observations and satellites, that we don't need big computers, that we don't do costly field work or maintain labs, or perhaps the worst one is our salaries are lower because of the market factors. Now, this is reflected in programme budgets. For example, the National Science Foundation budget for social science work on global change in the US is probably only 5, if 10% of the budget for the natural science aspect of global change. And the size of grant that you get as a social scientist is usually much less than half what you would get if you're a natural science. Now, rather than suggest a more equitable balance or an increase in funding for the social sciences, let me just select a few arguments against the myth. The first is in the area of observations. Earth scientists make strong arguments for satellite and ground observations in order to understand how the environment may be changing at global and regional scales. Yet human causes and impacts are also occurring at global and regional scales, where social scientists must often rely on highly aggregated socio-economic data that may, if we're lucky, provide a detailed snapshot every 10 years through the census, and that doesn't even happen in some countries of the world. Doing a census is extremely expensive, and most of them include very few questions of direct relevance to environmental issues. I would argue that we need much more comprehensive and frequent socio-economic data sets that collect data below the national scale but on a global scope if we're to understand the human dimensions of global change, and that will not be cheap. Another need is for properly designed networks of comparative studies to understand vulnerability, adaptation, and land use change. IPCC Working Group 2 is fraught with the lack of comparability in the case studies that are often the only peer-reviewed research that's available. And that's because it's very hard to get a grant for a large comparative study in the social sciences. And finally, I would note that the low budgets for social science funding on the environment are often insufficient to attract the cutting-edge social and economic modelers or analysts in our universities to participate in interdisciplinary environmental research. When I go over and talk to our world-class people in management information systems or in sociology or in business, they often say, you know, these grants just aren't big enough. I can get much bigger sources of funds. I do need high-end computing. I do have a high salary. In the business school, the salaries are high. And I have other areas where I could apply my expertise to high-priority social or business problems where it is easier to get good funding for my research. So, to conclude, I hope these remarks provoke some discussions about better ways to talk across the natural and social sciences so that we can better work together and solve global environmental problems. I know that there are many efforts by natural scientists to reach out to the social sciences as partners. And I tried this talk out on my co-director. I co-direct my environmental institute and I co-direct with a paleoclimatologist. And I said, please read this and tell me if you've thought any of these things during your career. And he said, actually, I've thought all of them at one point in my career, but I'm more educated now and I know that most of the things that you're saying, I now sort of understand that it's more complex than my original perceptions were of the social sciences. And as I noted earlier, I'm sure social scientists have just as many misunderstandings and myths about the natural sciences, and someone else should give that talk. Some of the issues I've discussed have definitely faded over my career. Global change research is probably less deterministic than it used to be. The role of population and common property resources are better understood. And I know, given time, I've missed out some important misunderstandings and myths. For example, about the human geographies of the developing world, there's a lot of misunderstanding and sort of caricatures of what the developing world is. And there's also a lot of myths about how we should govern global change, whether nation states are the way to do it or non-state actors might be better. But you've got your own experts like Joyita and Frank here who can talk to you about those. So let me thank you for your attention and once again wish you the best for the Amsterdam Global Change Institute, where natural and social sciences will work in harmony and mutual understanding to solve environmental challenges. Thank you.